producer is a member of the planning committee. Surprise, surprise. He's the former national reporter for Gay Community News, and he occasionally writes reviews for local newspapers. Jacob.
Thank you. As many of you know, I'm not a real model, but I do sometimes play one at conferences. Samuel Delany came to my attention as an author during my sophomore year of college, when a physics graduate student and sci-fi buff who was dating the woman I was sharing an apartment with, threw a copy of Delany's autobiography, The Motion of Light and Water, at my head and said, "Read this, it's got some pretty weird fag shit in it." Needless to say, I was excited that I had finally reached the point where I was engaging others on an intellectual level around my homo identity. So I stopped going to classes, not that I was going often anyway, and read the book over the course of 2 days. I was overwhelmed. Delany had vividly conveyed to me what it was like in Greenwich Village in the 60s, which for my queer generation is a legendary place and time. But it was his ability to write so frankly and passionately about the life of the mind, what he thought and felt, that amazed me. I then started tackling Delany's vast body of science fiction. What struck me again was Delany's skill at creating these luxurious and intense accounts of the inner mind. Even more fantastic than the extraterrestrial locales of his novels were the complex and bizarre inner worlds of his characters' psyches, much like our own. Perhaps my favorite coming-out story in gay literature comes from Delany's Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand. A character called Rat Korga is branded a freak, brainwashed and abused by those on his own planet, only to be the sole survivor when the planet is destroyed, and develop a queer relationship that destabilizes the galactic political structure. I was both comforted and alarmed by the notion, reading Rat Korga's story, that it seemed strangely familiar, not unlike the coming-out stories of myself and others I knew. I realized that science fiction, far from being the kid stuff it is so often dismissed as, can be a powerful genre for telling the queer experience, and for this I thank Samuel Delany. Samuel Delany is the winner of several Nebula Book Awards and has been a professor of comparative literature at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. At OutWrite 90, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contribution to queer writing. Similarly, he has received the Bill Whitehead Award for his lifetime achievement. Wesleyan University Press will release a reprinting of his tales of Nevèrÿon and Nevèrÿona sometime this month. He also has a new novel entitled They Fly at Ciron, available from Cannubula Press in Seattle. Those of you who have not yet read his autobiography or had it thrown at you will have the opportunity to read the British version, which is about 100 pages longer, when it's released in the U.S. by Richard Casack Books later this fall. Umberto Eco has called Delany the most important science fiction writer of his time, but his works go far beyond that genre. Delany has written numerous essays and delivered lectures on the subjects of race, class, sexuality, gender, and the AIDS epidemic. Currently, he's near completion of a pornographic novel. And he is a great storyteller. Please welcome Samuel Delany.
Well, it's time for some more weird fag shit. First, I want, of course, to thank Mark and the committee. As Jewell said, I mean, this has been a wonderful, wonderful experience, and lots of stuff to think about, lots of stuff to agree with, lots of stuff to disagree with, but I'm very, very happy that it took place. If you could speak to, even a few hundred gay writers, what would you say? That's not a question most of us have to ask ourselves very often, but this is getting on to the third or fourth time I've had to put this question to myself, or at any rate, put one very like it. So that I found myself sitting over my notebook pondering the problem probably means I'm in a rather unusual position. But the fact is, I don't know if I'm in a position to answer it any better than anyone else. What do I have to say that would be of interest, much less be of use, to a 22-year-old gay Asian woman desperately seeking a venue that will be sympathetic to her short stories? And what do I have to say that would interest at the same time, much less be of use, to a 57-year-old gay Latino writer who is returning to playwriting after more than 10 years of teaching and activism that, in her own words, simply swallowed up all my writing time? But I know both of you are out there because I've talked to you both on separate occasions in the last 6 months. What do I have to say of interest, much less of use, to a moderately well-known gay black writer of novels in his late 40s, who, because of IRS difficulties dating back to delinquencies when he was nowhere near as well known, is living at about the same level of financial security as the other two? And what do I have to say that would interest, at the same time, much less be of use, to a 28-year-old gay white poet, whose first collection of poems has just been accepted by a publisher putting a fair amount of energy into gay-oriented literature up till now, only the editor who has been so vigorously promoting gay writing there has just gone over to another publisher, so that the poet is afraid, and with good reason, that his book, though it will indeed finally come out, will be swallowed up without any of the special attentions a book needs to make any sort of dent at all in the minds of people who pay attention to such things. I know both of you are out there too, because I had brunch with one and drinks with the other less than a year ago. But now the question must intrude itself: why these specific little stories? What is their purpose? What's accomplished by mentioning these individuals that couldn't be accomplished just as easily by talking about some ideal, average gay writer, not quite male, not quite female, not quite white or black or Latina or Asian? Well, I'd hope that the specificity reminds us that no such average exists. It's a way of suggesting the range of gay writers. And I hope the specificity also suggests the realization that no range I could choose is itself exhaustive. If, for instance, I took all my examples from Asian lesbians, 122 and looking to publish, 135, and from a position as a creative writing teacher at the University of Illinois, wondering how she will get her second novel to place, 150, and writing romances under a pen name, and one working in France at age 71, a poet who writes primarily in French. What do I have to say to these four gay writers? Well, I hope one could hear echoing behind it all the times people have chosen their exemplary gay writers from a list of white males, 1, 2, 3, or 30, or 300 of them. At the same time, some among you are sure to find yourselves troubled by the fact that the range of gay writers suggested wholly by a list of Asian lesbians is certainly no more characteristic than the range suggested by the usual list of white males, even as one celebrates the difference from the usual, the forcing of attention to where it is not usually directed. The point, of course, is that uncharacteristic stories always have their troubling side, as they force us to consider the characteristic. Briefly, I'm saying that one cannot recognize or celebrate the uncharacteristic without remembering what is characteristic, a fact sometimes called in lit-crit jargon intertextuality. But I have assumed today that you have asked me here as a storyteller. There is, of course, a tale I would very much like to tell. The protagonist of that story is without sex. He or she is wholly constituted by gender: straight female, straight male, gay male, lesbian. What's more, our protagonist is unaware of any contradictions in the constitutive process, so that his or her blissfully smooth, seamless self may be called natural, unalienated, happy, or what you will. Our hero, for certainly she must be a hero, never does anything that is ego-dystonic, that does not please her, All her actions, purposeful, habitual, gratuitous, are egotonic. They feel good. The only unpleasant things that befall him, because she suddenly changed sex, inevitably originate outside the self. Whether he is defeated by them or triumphant over them, their external origin is a knowledge she is secure in. I hope we can all recognize in the basic situation here the story of that most glorious political comedy that we have yet been able to erect in the name of liberation. I adore it as much as anyone. But it worries me. For while it can make me thrill, rejoice, and wildly applaud, it never makes me weep, other than enjoy. And from what I know of the world, that is something to worry about. That is why I am worried. There was a movie theater in New York once called the Cameo, whose screen provender was heterosexual commercial porn, whose clientele was overwhelmingly male, whose management encouraged a high level of homosexual activities in its corridors, stairwells, side seats, and, to a lesser extent, its bathrooms, and in its upper balcony, a somewhat lower level of drug commerce and use. Of the many hundreds of men with whom I had sex there over more than a decade, from a dozen or so regulars with whom I had a settled and comfortable routine to a cavalcade of 1, 2, or 3-time encounters, a number stand out. One such was a young man, white, with dark hair, of about 25, who usually wore a suit jacket in a population largely black and Hispanic, and usually in jeans and sport shirts, sitting on the right-hand side of the theater, a seat apart. We had exchanged some 5 or 10 minutes of furtive eye contact when he motioned me to sit beside him, and we began to touch each other. He leaned toward me to whisper in a light working-class accent associated with the outlying boroughs of the city, "You know, I've never done anything like this before. All the other sex I've ever had has been with women, but somebody told me about this place, so I just thought." He shrugged, and we continued, easily enough considering his virgin status, to some satisfaction for us both. 3 months later, visiting the theater once more, after a stroll down one aisle and up the other, I noticed the same young man again sitting off on the right side. Recalling our last encounter, I slid immediately to sit a seat away from him, smiled, and said softly, "Hi." This time, he motioned me to the next seat right away, grinning and saying hello. As we began to touch each other, again he bent forward to explain, "You know, I've never done this before. With a man, I mean. I've had sex with women, sure, but this is my first time doing it with a guy." I thought better of contradicting him. We went on, as before, with the same results. Some months later, when I met him there again, he actually began to talking to me by saying, "Hello, good to see you, how have you been?" Quite ready to acknowledge that we knew each other. But when, in a moment, we started to touch, again he whispered, "You know, this is the first time I've ever done this. With a man, I mean." His litany, like some glorious stutter, recalls the dictum of Freud's, "Repetition is desire." But what troubles me in the memory of these encounters is, of course, how much of myself I can see in this young fellow. The range of minor, if not major, deceptions I have told myself in a lifetime of cruising. Now, what do you do? Me? Oh, I type manuscripts for a living. Certainly, that's my most common. But both his and mine also recall all the many stories all of us try to tell that somehow never turn out as accurate or as honest as we would like, through fear or desire, as if forces well beyond what we actually experienced were shaping the tale. But let me juxtapose a tale with this that happened in about the same general time period as the one I've just finished. It's a tale that will certainly seem uncharacteristic to many of you. While I can guess that to some others, it will suggest a sigh. Finally, someone is talking about a situation I have been in as a gay man, as a gay woman. I have a 19-year-old daughter. 16 years ago, when she was 3 and just beginning to read, and even more so enjoying being read to, like so many parents of those years, I noticed there were precious few children's books with female protagonists. Somehow, with the exception of Francis the Hedgehog, the illustrated bestiary of these books was overwhelmingly male. This struck me as ridiculous as well as unfair, and even, perhaps, dangerous. Who knew what happened to children whose only identificatory objects resided outside their race, their class, their sex, their gender, not to say their kind? Indeed, having proved itself powerful enough to stabilize the process by which the nation's schools had been desegregated, an entire discourse from the 50s was already in place, with its unpleasant suggestions precisely as to answers for that seemingly rhetorical question. What was a parent to do with such books when little girl animals were simply not extant? One book that fell into my hands back then was a charming and well-drawn affair about a little bear called Corduroy. What's more, Corduroy wore a pair of denim Oshkosh overalls, as did my 3-year-old on most of her days at play school. Certainly there was a point of correspondence. Why couldn't I simply up and change Corduroy's sex in the telling? With whiteout and felt-tip pen, I went so far as to remove the he's and change the pronouns to she's, in case Iva's reading had actually progressed further than I suspected. Then I sat down with my daughter. I began the story, and at the first pronoun, Iva twisted around in my lap and declared, "But Daddy, it's a boy bear." "I don't think so," I said. "The book says she right there." "But it's not," she insisted. I was sure of my argument. "How do you know it's a boy bear?" "Because he's got pants on." Suddenly, surely she had fallen into my trap. "But you're wearing pants," I explained. "In fact, you're wearing the same kind of Oshkosh overalls that Corduroy is wearing, and you're a little girl, aren't you?" "But Daddy," declared my 3-year-old in a voice of utmost disdain at my failure to recognize the self-evident, "that's a book." And the fact was, she was right. I was wrong. Corduroy was a boy. No matter how unfair or how pernicious it was or might prove, the discourse of children's books made him a boy. And that discourse was so sedimented that a single instance of rhetorical variation in 1977 registered not as a new and welcomed variant, but rather as a mistake self-evident to a 3-year-old. "Well," I said, "let's us make Corduroy a she. We'll pretend she's a girl, just like you." She'd also learned the discourse of let's pretend, surely from the same books that had taught her pants in books meant male. Iva settled back in my lap and seemed satisfied enough with the revised story. Today, in the shadow of its shelf, Corduroy has dust on its upper edge, but in the days when I first decided to tell this story, I phoned Iva in the city where she was then getting ready to go off to college next year, and in preparation for the telling, I asked her if she had any memory of the incident. No, she didn't. But once I was looking through some of my old picture books, and I remember finding Corduroy and realizing someone had taken a pen and changed all the he's to she's. I remember wondering why they'd done it. But though one set applied to children's books and one set applied to male self-presentation to the world, I wonder what finally was the difference, if any, between the codes that determined Iva's reading of Corduroy and the equally strict codes that determined that young man's tale of heterosexual orientation and homosexual virginity in the cameo. The first time I taught for a full term at an American university, I had my 32nd birthday while I was there as a visiting professor. As sometimes happens when a writer comes to a new school, a handful of the brighter students attached themselves to me, and soon I felt that some of those students had even become my friends. Among them was a brilliant young Dominican woman who, for the sake of the telling, I'll call Carla, and who, while I knew her, had her 19th birthday. Full-figured, with black hair and astonishing gray-green eyes, Carla turned a questioning energy on everything about her. She was an attractive personality for anyone who enjoyed the pleasures of thinking for its own sake. That term I came out to my students as soon as it flowed from the material we were dealing with. If it did not put them at ease, it made me feel more comfortable. But I was clear about announcing the fact that I was gay within the first 2 weeks of classes. The isolation of visiting professor moving into a new campus, and in my case it was also returned to the United States after 2 years in England, can be extreme. The few people, including Carla, who helped alleviate it, I was grateful to. One day, however, when she was walking with me across the campus, Carla confessed somewhat jokingly that she was sexually interested in me and would have pursued it with some passion had I been straight. "I'm just a slave to my body," was her comment. It has remained with me for years. From that afternoon, I know the feeling. But I reiterated that I wasn't straight. Still, I hoped we could stay friends. A notable current of my adult social education, and I feel it's very near the core of what I sometimes characterize as what it means to be a responsible gay male, is not to be irrationally terrified either by female anger or female desire. I enjoyed Carla's friendship, and I hope she could still enjoy mine, even if she had to suppress an overt sexual component, a relationship I have had and enjoyed with many men. I decided to make no effort to distance myself from her, but give her the opportunity to reconceive the friendship in non-sexual terms, an opportunity a good number of men, both straight and gay, have given me. Classes ended, and about a week before I was to return to New York, Carla, an older male student, a carpenter I'll call Fred, an aspiring poet in his late 20s, whom I confess I was attracted to, but Fred had made it as clear to me as I had made it to Carla that he did not want to pursue a sexual relationship, even though, in his own words, the possibility flattered him. Carla, Fred, and another woman student who was Carla's close friend invited me out with them for the evening. The specific suggestion came from Carla. She explained I was to be their guest for the night, and that dinner and dancing afterward were their way of showing their gratitude for my term's teaching. A very pleasant night it started off. Somehow, however, I ended up with several more drinks than I wanted to. Twice, when I came back to the table from a trip to the John, my half-finished drink had been replaced by a full one, and at least 3 other times a round I didn't really want at all was brought over my protests. But we were dancing, having a good time, and there was much talk of drinking up. In Fred's van, we returned from that very loud Buffalo dance bar, which in 1975 claimed to be the original home of the Buffalo Chicken Wing. And when we reached the double tier of motel rooms in which the university had housed me that year, Carla announced she would give me some help upstairs to my room. I only realized perhaps I needed some when I was halfway there. In my room, she pushed me backwards onto the bed, grabbed my arm to keep me from falling onto the floor, and proceeded to pull off first my clothes, then hers. She climbed on top of me, then, at her insistence, we made love. I had the presence to ask if she was using any birth control. She answered, "What do you think I am, crazy?" The only other interruption was once when I pulled away to race into the bathroom to be messily ill in the toilet. Solicitously, she brought me back to bed. The next morning, it was a while before anyone felt like moving, and in the haze of my hangover, I recall her rising to dress and leave. Sometime later that day, she returned. I answered the door, she entered, and immediately began to undress. "Wait a minute," I said. "Let us talk." And so for a while we did. It seems, she confessed, her plan from the beginning had been to take me out for the evening, get me drunk, bring me home, and, in her words, fuck your brains out. "Yeah," said Fred on the phone a little later, "but I told her she probably wouldn't succeed. I don't think you can really do that kind of thing with a guy, can you?" I pointed out to Carla that 1, this was just not what I wanted our relationship to be. 2, if I had done the same thing to her or to any of her undergraduate friends, she would have been justifiably furious. "Didn't you just tell me about a week ago about some male professor here who tried something rather like this on a young woman that you knew? As I recall, you were pretty pissed off at him." "Yes," she said, "but it worked when he did it, too." "Carla," I said, "if we're going to be any sort of friends, you're going to stop this. We're going to stop this." "Yes," she said, "I guess we are." And she left. And left me wondering if indeed we could be friends anymore. I hope you find this story so far, for it is not over, troubling in all its resonances. I certainly did. My term was up at the university. 3 years later, when I was living in New York with my then lover, I received a call from Carla. She was now in her second year of law school. She was there in the city. I said quite sincerely that it would be nice to see her again. I mentioned that I was living with a lover and had been for more than a year. She sounded very pleased, and about a week later she came by. Her dark hair was cut very short, and she wore very tight white jeans. "I want you to know," she told me, as we sat and talked in my study, "that I took your advice." "Advice?" I asked. "What advice?" "I'm a lesbian now." "This," I asked, "was advice I gave you?" I can't imagine my advising anyone to become a lesbian or a gay man. Although I hear it happens, I wasn't particularly aware that it was any more common than becoming straight. "Well," she said, "what I meant is that I followed your example." "What example?" I asked, totally lost. "Well, you were married for 13 years or so, weren't you, before you became gay?" "Ah," I said. "No, I've been pretty much aware that I was gay since I was 11 or 12, though, yes, I did get married. But now at least I have some idea what you're talking about. But advising someone to become gay, that's like advising someone they'd be better off black than white. Sure, in anger, you could suggest someone might learn something if they experience some oppression, but no one who's part of an oppressed group who's really thought about the nature of that oppression is going to advise someone else to join in." Now it was her turn to say, "Ah." She went on, "Well, it's true. You never said it in so many words, but I thought that's what you were doing. Anyway, whether you gave it to me or not, it's been the best advice I've ever taken." "I'm very glad that it was," I said. "But when next you think I'm giving you advice, do ask me to tell you directly what it is. I'd feel better about it even if you don't." 2 years later, Carla passed her bar exam. And on another visit, in which she came by to tell me both of her new job working as a civil rights lawyer and of her new and most satisfying relationship with another young woman, she said, "You must have been very angry at me back at school. I have a very different take on all that now. We handle sexual harassment cases. That must have been quite dreadful for you." For whatever it's worth, I told her, I wasn't angry. I don't know whether it has anything to do with it or not, but at least once in my life I have been held down by 2 men and raped. It was a lot less pleasant than what you did. "Well," she said, "I'm glad you still let us be friends. I've gotten a lot from it." "I'm glad too," I said, "so have I." I have no way to be sure, of course, what that experience meant to Carla, or indeed how often it returned to her. Here we are speaking, and I feel it's important for me to say it clearly, of a situation where laws were violated, where the kinds of moral and ethical concerns Carla herself was now working with on her job were, on both sides, mine and hers, called sharply into question. Were I asked what tales were characteristic of my young manhood as a gay male, what comes to mind are those nights circumstances put me beside some other man, peacefully asleep, whom I knew I could not touch, and so lay sleepless the night in a paroxysm of desire. But all the tales I shall be telling here I've chosen precisely because they're uncharacteristic. So, yet another tale. In this case, of a muscular Puerto Rican with curly black hair, whose work shirt bore the name, we'll say, was Mike, in yellow stitching across the gray pocket. He wore a green jacket with a green and yellow knitted collar. To the same theater in which I've met the first young man I spoke of, across the back yellow letters spelled out Aviation Trades High School, from which I presume he must have graduated sometime over the 3.5 years I knew him. Mike was a regular visitor to the Cameo as I was. He was handsome in a bear-like way. From a couple of quiet approaches, however, I'd gathered he was not interested in me. From time to time, I would see him sitting in various seats in the balcony or orchestra. Nearly as frequently, as I walked up or down between the lobby and the balcony, I would pass him sitting on the stairs toward the top, sometimes leaning forward, arms across his knees, sometimes leaning back, elbows on the step, 2 above and behind. Once, after I'd stopped paying much attention to Mike, I was sitting a few seats away from another black man in green work clothes and dilapidated basketball sneakers. Knees wide against the back of the seat in front of him, he was slouched low in his chair watching the film. Mike, I noticed, was slouched equally in the row ahead, one seat to the right. Then something moved near the floor. I glanced down to see a hand. Under the seat and behind the metal foot of the ancient theater chair, it looked rather disembodied, but the fingertips now and again brushed the rubber rims and black cloth uppers of the man's right sneaker. Glancing at the top of Mike's head, then down at the man's foot, the man seemed oblivious to what was happening. I realized Mike had reached down between the seats and was playing with the man's shoe. Ah, I thought, in all the self-presumed sophistication of my own sexual experience, so that explains it. And 4 or 5 times over the next few months, I noticed Mike, now in the balcony, now in the orchestra, at the same practice with different men. This was back in the years when today's ubiquitous running shoe was just emerging as the casual fashion choice. As is more usual than not, I was at least a year behind most other people, and it was only that week that I broke down and got my first pair, in which I confess I never ran in my life. They were a conservative gray. One day I stopped into the Cameo, and on my way to the balcony passed Mike sitting on the steps. Several people stood near the top watching the movie. I stopped behind them, largely to watch them. Minutes later, I happened to glance down. Mike's hand was on the step, the edge of his palm against my shoe sole. I was surprised, because till then I had considered myself outside his interests. My first and almost innocent thought was that his hand straying to that position had been an accident, even while more worldly experience said no, precisely because of what I knew of him already. While it might have been an accident with someone else, his hand resting there could only have been on purpose, though his attention all seemed to be down the stairs. I tried to appear as though I was not paying any attention to him. He continued to appear as though he was not paying any attention to me. I moved my foot accidentally, a quarter of an inch from his hand. His hand, a half a minute later, was again against my shoe. Again, accidentally, I moved my foot a quarter of an inch closer to press against his fingers, and 2 of his fingers, then 3, accidentally, slid to the top of my foot. In 10 minutes, Mike had turned to hold my foot with both his hands, pressing it to his face, his mouth, leaning his cheek down to rub against it. To make the point I'm coming to in all this, I must be clear that I found all this sexually gratifying enough so that I continued to rub his hand, his face, his chest, his groin with my shoe until at last, genitals loose from his gray work pants, he came. And over the next 3 weeks, when we had some 4 more of these encounters, I came as well during one of them. We do not even have a term for the perversion complementary to fetishism. The myth of the sexual fetish is precisely that it is solitary. Its assumed pathology is the fact that it is thought to be non-reciprocal. A major symptom of the general insensitivity of our extant vocabulary is that as soon as fetishism is presumed to move into the realm of reciprocity, the vocabulary and analytical schema of sadomasochism take it over, and to me this seems wholly to contravene common sense and my own experience. Mike and I became friendlier now, when we were not directly sexually encountering one another. If we met outside the theater on the street, we said hello and nodded. If we passed in the theater stairwell, we might exchange brief small talk. There were no words at all, however, about what we were doing sexually. It was clear to me that Mike did not want to flaunt his practices before the other patrons, with some of whom he was rather more friendly than he was with me. Among the theater's younger clientele were a number of hustling drag queens and pre-ops. Their teasing and joking could become intense, and these were the people who, in the theater, were Mike's conversational friends. Running shoes, at least the brand I'd brought at that time, do not last as long as they should. Soon it was time to replace them. I thought of Mike. By now, though, I'd glimpsed him several times get as involved with other men's running shoes or sneakers as he could from time to time with mine. I felt nothing but empathy and goodwill toward him, but clearly some excited him more than others. The specifics of his preference, however, I hadn't been able to piece together. How, I wondered, do I ask about such a thing? How do I put such a question into language? Not much later, when I was getting up from my seat in a legitimate 42nd Street movie house where I'd gone to see some genre horror film, I saw Mike, also leaving. We smiled across the crowd and nodded to each other. I decided that the best thing to do was to be as open and above board about my curiosity as possible. You know, I said as we joined each other walking toward the lobby, I've got to buy a new pair of sneakers one of these days soon. What kind do you think I should get? He seemed not to have heard me, so I persisted. Is there any kind you like particularly? Some kind you think are the best? Mike stopped, just inside the lobby door. He turned to me, a look blooming on his face that, in memory, seemed a combination of an astonishment and a gratitude near terror. He leaned forward, took my arm, and whispered with an intensity that made me step back, "Blue, please, blue." Then he rushed away into the street. I'd expected an answer at the same fervor I'd offered my question, but I confess that afternoon, with an anxiety that somehow did not seem all mine but borrowed, at Modell Sporting Goods I purchased a pair of blue Adidas. 2 days later, when I wore them to the theater, however, Mike was not there. Nor did I see him on any of my next dozen visits. After a few months, I realized he had dropped the place from among his regular cruising sites. 3 times over the year, I glimpsed Mike in his green jacket with the yellow letters, now on a far corner under the marquee at the Port Authority bus terminal, now by the subway kiosk at 72nd Street, now with his hands in his pockets, hurrying down 45th Street toward 9th Avenue. But I never saw him in the theater again. I've often wondered if our encounter in the second movie had something to do with his abandonment of the first. I can only hope that, among his friends, he might be telling his version of this tale, possibly somewhere this afternoon, for whatever didactic purposes of his own. A few years ago, however, when I first wrote about Mike to a straight male friend of mine, a Pennsylvania academic, he wrote me back, "If you can explain the fascination with licking sneakers so that I can understand it, you can probably explain anything to anybody." My first thought was to take up the challenge. But as I considered it, I realized all I could explain, of course, was my side of the relationship. I'd found Mike desirable well before I had known of his predilections. Using some formulation by Lacan, one desires the desire of the other. It seems easy enough to understand that if Mike's desire detoured through a particular focus on my sneakers, it was still his desire and therefore exciting. Perhaps not quite so much for me as it would have been if it had focused on my hands, my mouth, all over my body, on some aspect of my mind or my genitals. But it was exciting nevertheless. As I thought about it, it occurred to me that in similar environments I'd actually observed many hours of fetishistic behavior by any number of men over the years, though most of those had involved work shoes or engineer's boots in specifically S&M contexts. So therefore I knew something quite real about that behavior. But at the same time, I'd spent perhaps less than a single hour talking about that behavior with any or all of the men involved, including Mike. That meant there was a great deal I didn't know. What could I explain? What could I not explain? Even though I responded sexually to Mike, I could no more speak for him than I could speak sexually for any of the very few women I had gone to bed with, or indeed for any of the many, many men. A truism in the field of gay studies that, like any truism, it might be time to review. It's one that again and again in other discussions I felt must be stated at the head of any number of talks and articles on matters gay. I first wrote the following paragraph sometime in the middle 70s. That others have chosen to quote it so many times in the years since makes me very proud. The situation of the lesbian in America is vastly different from the situation of the gay male. A clear acknowledgement of this fact, especially by male homosexuals, is almost the first requirement for any sophisticated discussion of homosexual politics in this country. Gay men and gay women may well express solidarity with each other, but in the day-to-day working out of the reality of liberation, the biggest help we can give each other is a clear and active recognition of the extent and nature of the different contexts and a rich working sympathy for the different priorities these contexts, for want of a better word, engender. Paradoxically, it is because I wrote that, and because I still stand by it, that I want to tell another worrisome tale. It is a simple one. It happened on a chill early spring afternoon during my middle 20s, when I sat on the rim of the fountain in Washington Square with a hefty young woman about my age who wore glasses, black jeans, a leather jacket, and who went by the name Hank. We talked from the breeze-laced height of the day till the sky above us deepened to indigo, sharing our sexual histories. We were not talking of my adventures on the docks or in the subway johns or about my frustrations at trying to establish a more lasting relation in such a context. We did not discuss her bar life or the cycle of seemingly endless hurts that were serial monogamy. Rather, we talked about the burgeonings of our sexual awareness in the family, in school, in the street, and in the times we moved from one to the other, now in our early summer camp experiences, now on our visits to cousins in the country, or with playmates away, at least from overseeing adults. We talked mostly of happenings that occurred before ages 13 and 14, and of experiences that certainly seemed for both of us then directly constitutive of who we were, who we had become. Both of us, again and again, were astonished at how many experiences we shared, by how many of the separate lessons that we'd learned were clearly congruent.
This session is continued on side A of the next cassette.
Welcome to the National Lesbian and Gay Writers Conference, held October 8th through the 10th, 1993 in Boston, Massachusetts. We now join our speakers as the session is just beginning.
Of who we were, who we had become. Both of us, again and again, were astonished at how many experiences we shared, by how many of the separate lessons that we'd learned were clearly congruent, and how much of the stuff of the initial awareness of the sexual, from the body out, seemed all but identical for the two of us. But given the time we had our conversation, no one had yet told us that we were supposed to be all that different. Hank remarked on the similarities, so did I. For better or worse, the solidarity I feel with many lesbians is still based on such experiences. What my understanding of that vastly differing context explains for me is why those conversations are rarer for me with women than they are with men. An understanding of that vastly differing context allows me to translate from women's experiences to mine when such translation is possible. An understanding of that vastly differing context explains to me why so frequently no translation takes place at all. But what that context does not in any way do is validate the notion for me of some transcendental, irreducible sexual difference between men and women, either in terms of sex or gender, straight or gay, a difference that becomes the ground for any and every social difference one might want to elaborate from it. Indeed, it is precisely my understanding of the specific complexity of the context that makes an acceptance of that irreducible and transcendental difference impossible for me. Certainly the identification I speak of is always partial, problematic, full of mistakes and misreadings. But that is my experience with any identification I feel with any other. Male, female, gay, straight. Thinking about discussing this with you, I was wondering at the same time about the inside-outside metaphor that common sense so frequently asks us to use, but which has come under an intensive critique in the recent years. For in terms of the progression of my message-filled, didactic, true, and highly coded tales, we are about to take up the phrases inside language and outside language. I did not tell Hank all of my stories. Doubtless she did not tell me all of hers. I told her, for example, none of the stories I've so far told here. And the stories I did tell, it occurred to me when I was reviewing the incident for inclusion in this account today, were none of them included in the autobiography I wrote 20 years later, though I still remember them very well, which is to say, they still remain largely outside language. Diana Fuss has written, introducing the fine volume she had edited, Inside Out, Lesbian Thoughts, Gay Theories, the figure of inside-outside cannot easily or ever finally be dispensed with. It can only be worked on and worked over, itself turned inside out to expose its critical operations and internal machinery. Fuss begins the argument I have quoted from the philosophical opposition between heterosexual and homosexual, heterosexuals representing the inside and homosexuals representing the outside. But I think there's a finer economy of inside and outside where her point is just as valid. That is the notion of sexuality itself as always occurring partly inside language and partly outside it. I'm not speaking of a hypostasized language as an unarticulated totality besides which some sex acts occur in an ideal silence apart from the word, while others are swaddled in a constant approved and privileged rhetoric. I speak rather of language as an articulated and variegated set of discursive fields, many of them interpenetrating, but many of whose distinct levels bear a host of economic relations one to another. Some of those levels are privileged, some are not. Some are notably of more ephemeral than others. These levels fall into hierarchies of reproducibility, accessibility, and permanence, and some never leave that most ephemeral state, the internal speech of the individual we call unarticulated thought. In that sense, of course, all human activity is inside language. But by the very same set of distinctions, all human activity takes place inside certain orders of language and outside certain others, and that is the force of the metaphor behind what I've said about activities inside language and outside language till now, as it will be behind what I will have to say in the discussion to come. As comfortable as I am calling the tales I've told here true, these tales are nevertheless quite coded. Coded as to their selection, as to their narrative form, as to their reference, their texture, and their structure. They are as coded as the tales in children's books. They are as coded as the lies told to minimize confusion in so many sexual situations. They are as coded as any succession of incidents any of us could recognize as a tale. And the conventions that code them were more or less sedimented well before the incidents that prompted the accounts took place. Despite their sedimentation, however, these codes have also shifted with history. Such tales certainly could not have been told, say, 35 years ago at a formal public gathering inside this particular order of language. One day, in a Central Park playground in the summer of the same year in which my daughter had learned the discourse of children's books, around the fountain and having shed all clothing an hour back, half a dozen kids in my daughter's play school group all clustered around a 3.5-year-old girl named Mishkatel, who enthusiastically posed a game to Sasha and Iva and Nord and Aisha. This was, recall, the 70s. Let's see who can pee-pee the furthest. And while I looked on, I confess surprise, the 5 of them stood to the ankles in the water at the fountain edge and let whiz. The girls, of course, without exception, won, since in general the urinary tract exits from the body proper, horizontally, or even with a slightly upward tilt. And because everyone was just standing there letting fly, the 2 little boys, Sasha and Nord, who dangled a bit, had not thought to use their hands to guide their stream, and so generally watered in a downward slant rather than straight out. Mishkatel, Iva, and Aisha all more or less tied, and left Nord and Sasha frowning down at their self-evident lack and symbol of powerlessness, marking the male site of greater physical vulnerability. In a society where children play regularly naked with one another, this cannot be an anomaly. But I had to ask myself sometime later if I was empowered, as it were, that's one of my words, to see this by a situation from not a full decade before, when, in 1969, I had lived in San Francisco, and a nude sunbathing and beer fest had started on the tarred-over roof of our Natoma Street flat. 8 or half a dozen of us were sitting around naked drinking beer when, as several of the young men had already done, one young woman got up, went to the back edge of the tar paper, and there, gazing down, proceeded to urinate off the edge with as high-flying an arc as anyone could want. I remember how cool we were all being, in what I suspect for most of us was some astonishment. A young woman was about to speak when a young man asked, "How did you do that?" Her answer was classic: "You aim, stupid." Then she proceeded to demonstrate how, with 2 fingers of one hand in a V turned down over the upper part of the vaginal crevice, one could control the direction of one's stream. I am a writer. Needless to say, I incorporated the scene, or one based closely on it, in my next novel. Some months after the book appeared, I received a letter signed by a group of 5 women in Vancouver that said, in brief, "Thanks." But the tale has its converse. In the late 60s, a cheap series of chartered buses ran back and forth between New York and San Francisco, generically called the Gray Rabbit. By the end of its run, the restroom on the back of the coach had long since lost its door, in general, with the rather freewheeling young men and women who availed themselves of the $45 one-way fare, this was not a large problem in itself. What became a problem was that after the first day of the trip, because the lack of springs in the back roads, thanks to the men on the bus, the restroom became pretty foul. And the women on the bus didn't like it. The problem was eventually solved by a woman driver who took a length of 2x4, a hammer and some nails, and fixed it into the doorway at a little above chest height, and put another one behind it so that there was simply no way to approach the commode in a fully upright position. On the first of the 2x4, she hung a sign, "You don't sit, you don't piss." The problem was more or less solved. But the point is that women can, and some do, urinate standing up, and men can, and some do, urinate sitting down, all for their separate reasons. As to arcs and distances, well, in the same conversation in which I asked my daughter about corduroy, I asked if she remembered her infantile peeing contest. No, she didn't, any more than she remembered the female corduroy. But is the reason such incidents as this are not usually talked of, speculated over, theorized, included in our speculative elaborations on the way our culture works because of some massive discursive exclusion? From such memories, however, I turn to others that are so like the experiences that prompted Freud to his theories of penis envy. When my daughter, at aged 4, a year after her forgotten triumph in the park pee contest, in imitation of me, would stand at the commode gazing down, and with her hands on her genital regions make hissing sounds. In another series of stories I wrote at about the same time, you will find that a treatise and pretty much my thinking on all the incidents above. I also asked my adult daughter if she remembered ever wanting a penis. No, she said with some consideration, but I certainly remember when I was 4 wanting to urinate standing up. It seemed so much more convenient. A reasonable want for a 4-year-old who, at 3, already could and had. But what codes, I can only ask you, while I hope the answer troubles you, have kept these tales outside of language for so long? No less coded, and no less true, is this last of my tales. Its coding today may even be the most self-evident, the most obvious. One bright November afternoon, as I was passing just across the street from the Cameo, the theater I was telling you about earlier, a young man in his early 20s, slight and half a head shorter than I, came up to me. Pretty clearly Irish-American, he was wearing a jean jacket and a broad smile. His hands were in his pockets, and in the sunny chill, he breathed out white wisps. "Hey, you want to get together with me? I've seen you coming around here a lot. Somebody told me you write science fiction. I like that stuff. I read it all the time. Making with somebody who writes about spaceships and time machines and flying saucers and stuff, that'd be pretty cool." I laughed. "Sorry," I told him, "not today," and went on about my business. A few days later, I passed him again, and again he approached me. "Hey, when are you and me going to get together?" Smiling, I shook my head and walked on. Days later, the third time I passed him, he called me over to a doorway he was standing in, and when I came, bombarded me in an intense whisper with a detailed and salacious account of what he could do for me. He finished up, "And I ain't expensive either. Man, I'm a street person. I can't afford to charge high prices. Isn't that a bitch? I just want to make enough to get high." "Look," I said, "first of all, what's your name?" Let's say he said it was Billy. "Billy," I said, shaking his offered hand, "I was about to get something to eat. I'll buy you a sandwich, but that's all." "Sure," he said, "it's a start. Maybe something will develop." "Nothing's going to develop," I told him, "except a sandwich, but come on." In a hot plate bar 2 blocks south on 8th Avenue, I had a pastrami on rye, while Billy had a roast beef on whole wheat, which he ate with 2 or 3 fingers of both hands pushing and working inside his mouth for seconds at a time to tear the food apart. No beer, he just wanted a soda. While he drank it, he listed the titles and summarized the plots of the last dozen science fiction novels he'd read. I allowed as how he had good taste. Wiping at his mouth with his napkin now, he apologized. "You know, I used to be a pretty neat eater. Would you believe it? But I guess living out here, I'm turning into kind of a pig. It's my teeth. They give me a lot of trouble, and a lot of things I can't really chew. How come you won't give me a tumble?" "Do you really want to know?" He sat back in the high wooden booth seat and countered, "Do you really want to tell me?" I laughed. "You seem like a smart kid. You're actually pretty good looking, and you keep yourself clean. I'd never have thought you were living rough." "I wash in the bathroom at Port Authority every morning." He winked at me. I do sort of okay out there. Billy, the truth is I just don't find you sexually attractive. And if I'm going to pay for it, even the price of a bottle of crack, it seems to me I should be getting something I'll enjoy. You'd enjoy it, Billy said, with a nod of mock smugness. I'd see to that. But I get your point. Then he narrowed his eyes. You say I look good, so how did you know I was a crackhead? How did you know I was a science fiction writer, I asked. It's a fairly small world out here. Billy nodded. But 2 weeks later, the next time I ran into him, Billy approached me with, I'm hungry. You want to buy me a sandwich? Which I did, the second of perhaps a dozen over that winter and into spring. During our meals, I got the pieces of a story, tedious in its similarity in the similarity of its details to any 100 like tales of like young men and young women, relations severed angrily and violently by a Brooklyn family because of his drug involvement, a penally checkered career throughout his late adolescence. His last 2 years, he was 24, living on the street, most of that time, in Billy's particular case, sleeping in the upper tier of the Port Authority bus station at gate 235, which, because the gate was not in service that year, became the rotational sleeping space of some dozen young people, all but Billy in those days black, in an uneasy and often violated truce, both with each other and the station authorities. Some of those details bespoke a level of organization, however, notably higher than most street druggies maintained, especially those on crack. Billy always kept 2 shirts and a pair of pants in the dry cleaners around on 9th Avenue, one of which he took out every 3 or 4 days. Sometimes I gave Billy science fiction novels to read. As such friendships will, this one tapered off to where we just called hello to each other on the street when we passed. Later, from time to time, we only nodded. The Cameo changed its name to the Adonis. Then, one summer's day, as I was walking up 8th Avenue, I saw Billy sitting on the single step in a doorway, plaid sleeves rolled up his forearms, still neat and clean enough so that most people would not guess immediately he was homeless. As I looked at him, he looked up at me, elbows on his knees, and one hand holding his other wrist. Well, he said, I got it. That halted me. I searched about for a reasonable response. Billy was not above feigning illness to put the touch on you. For 3 months, about 6 months before, he'd had a low-grade ulcer which, while he treated it with Mylanta and emergency room prescriptions, he'd not been above working up into something more serious to hustle a few dollars from sympathetic passers-by. But this seemed outside Billy's usual range of fictions. I asked, any idea how you picked it up? Oh, he said, sure, needles. I'd never do anything sexually that would give it to me. He nodded, sharing needles. Well, I said, at a loss to think of an appropriate rejoinder, you've just got to take care of yourself. Then I walked on, while I realized the fact that Billy had not asked me for a handout as I moved away was probably the surest confirmation of the truth of what he had just told me. I saw Billy a couple of other times, even had another sandwich with him. I had the pneumonia, was how he put it, at the hot plate bar. He dug inside his mouth. They said at the hospital if I got it again, that would be it. They also said, since they knew I had it now, if I showed up with pneumonia again, they wouldn't take me back. Can they do that? I guess if you don't got any money, they can do what they want, right? All I could say was that, honestly, I didn't know. Work had already taken me out of the state. The next few times I saw Billy were in my sporadic trips back to the city. October, 3 years ago, when the weather took a final leap into Indian summer's warmth, briefly I was in New York and walking up 8th Avenue. In the same doorway, where I occasionally used to find Billy sitting, I noticed a gaunt man, his shoulders near anorexically thin, his eyes and temples were sunken. The lower part of his face was swollen, so that he seemed a sort of anorexic Neanderthal. He wore a baggy blue T-shirt, and his legs came out of a pair of even baggier Bermudas, like sticks. He looked up to catch me staring at him, and I thought to look away. But slowly he smiled and said, "What's the matter, Chip? Don't you recognize me?" "Billy?" I said. Then, because I couldn't think of anything else to say, I said, "How are you doing?" "Pretty bad," he said, matter-of-factly. His voice was decidedly slurred, and I wondered if the swelling in his jaw was the packing of some internal bandage, but I don't think so. I kept on walking because for the last year that's what I did when I saw Billy. Now, later that evening, I was in one of the neighborhood gay bars, Katz. I'd come down to talk with a gay friend, Joe, a recent Jesuit novice who'd left his calling and whom I'd helped to get a job in publishing. We'd been catching up on his adventures and mine when the door opened and 3 young men came in, Billy among them. He saw us, grinned, came over, draped one matchstick arm around Joe's neck and one around mine. "Hey," Billy said with the same slur of the afternoon, "you guys know each other? Joe's my special friend here," which Joe confirmed with a grin and a hug. "Just a second, I'll see you in a minute." And Billy was off to say something to the other hustlers he'd come in with. Again, I had no idea of the protocol for such situations. "Billy's a good kid," I told Joe. "How long have you known him?" "Oh, about 3 weeks." I said. Then I said, "You know, of course, he's got AIDS. At least he told me he did some time back." "I kind of," Joe nodded, "suspected it. He doesn't say the word, but he talks about it." That didn't make me feel much better. But Joe said, "We don't really do anything anyway. We lie around and hold each other. He says he likes it and it makes him feel good, but that's all." At which point Billy was back, arms again around our shoulders, bony head thrust between. "Joe says he'll take care of me when I get real sick," Billy announced straight off. "He's a special guy, like you." "That's good," I said. Joe, at any rate, was smiling. Billy reached behind him and pulled a stool up between us. As he sat, his baggy Bermudas rode up his gaunt thigh, till his uncircumcised genitals hung loose. Reaching down with one finger, he hooked the plaid edge back even more. "It's amazing," he said, and I realized I was getting used to his slur. "Most of my Johns haven't deserted me, but that's because I always gave him a good time, I guess." Though I had never been his John, looking at him now was a little hard to believe. Gazing down, Billy apostrophized himself, and I did not think of Mishkatel and Sasha and Aisha and Nord and Iva, gazing at themselves 13 and 12 years ago. "You brought me a lot of dope, made me some money, some friends, gave me a good time." Shifting to the side, he pulled his shorts leg down. "Got me into some trouble, too." He looked back up, grinning at us between swollen jaw and bony brow. But for the first time in the years I'd known him, I felt sexual excitement rise toward Billy. I had another drink. I brought him and Joe, respectively, a ginger ale and a beer. I shook hands with them both, wished them well, and went home. October's days of Bermuda shorts weather, such as we are experiencing now, we all know are brief. A month and a half later, when I happened to get Joe on the phone at work, I asked how Billy was. He told me, "A little while after I saw you at the bar, when it started to get cold, Billy showed up sick at my place. I kept him there for a week of spectacular diarrhea. Really, the guy was exploding shit, or water, mostly, after a while. Then he said he wanted to leave. I didn't think he could leave, but he went off somewhere. I haven't seen him since." No one has seen Billy since. You and I know that Billy is dead. Nor is Billy the only one in these tales to die. Carla was killed in an accident during a rainstorm when a metal piece fell from a building cornice and struck her down as she was hurrying to bring her girlfriend an umbrella in an outlying subway station. While I rode on the subway, I saw the Daily News headline across the aisle, "Lawyer slain in Brooklyn," and only a day later learned that the lawyer was my friend. And it was as stunning and as horrid, and certainly more interruptive in the lives of her friends than this intrusion of its awful and arbitrary fact here. I spoke at Carla's memorial service, and whenever I have said of her here, she was a very easy person to praise. Billy's death? I called a number of hospitals. So did Joe. As far as we could learn, Billy did not die in any of them, though his name was on record at 2, outpatient treatment for a junior ulcer at 1, and a stay for pneumocystis pneumonia at the other. But unless he went very far afield, he probably wouldn't have been admitted, and Billy was bonded to that central city neighborhood, sometimes called the 42nd Street area, sometimes the Theater District, and occasionally the Minnesota Strip, through his very familiarity with it, by his knowledge of the surge and ebb of its drug traffic, because so much of what he knew was how to eke from it the limited life it allowed. So let's be very clear what he died from. Lack of medical attention that meant he died 6 months or 6 years before he had to, time enough to read an awful lot of very good science fiction novels. Well, why, in our clean, well-lighted space, this afternoon do we need this story? Why do we need to add to these others this tale of a moment's fugitive desire en route to an untraceable death behind some burned-out building or in an out-of-service bus gate at the port or beneath a bench on an 8th Avenue subway station, a death that could have been meaningfully longer life? It was 4 years ago, maybe 5 now, that I first realized that among my personal friends and acquaintances, AIDS had become the biggest single killer, beating out cancer, heart disease, and suicide combined. Certainly Billy's death was not typical of my friends, nor is his death typical at all of theirs. Why not then tell of a cleaner, more uplifting death? Well, I tell it because such deaths are not clean and uplifting. I tell it because the story troubles me. The purpose of all these tales, it troubles me because it is as atypical as it is. Understand, these are not the stories of a gay man who, after 13 years of a troubled marriage, went on to live with a male lover for 8 years and has been living with another male lover now for almost 4, a story that many would certainly recognize as more characteristic, and one I could tell that I could equally call true. Understand, I recount these stories not as the strangest things that ever happened to me. Purposefully, I am not going into the particulars here about the well-dressed 60-year-old gentleman in a 96th Street men's room who asked for my shit to eat, or the American tourist who picked me up in Athens who would only make love to me if I wore a wristwatch with a metal band and that band low on the arm, or the young Italian who had me hammer his stretched scrotum to a piece of pine planking with half a dozen 10-penny nails. Again, for what they're worth, true. What I'm trying to remind you is simply enough that these are all part of a gay experience, my gay experience. I can't claim them as characteristic of some hypostasized universal gay male experience involving, or gay experience involving the range of gay women and gay men, black and white, middle class and working class, since they are not even characteristic of my own. Perhaps they could occur only in the margins of the experience of one sexually active black American urban gay male in the last decades of the 20th century. But in terms of that experience, they are a good deal more informative than Sunday brunches and Judy Garland records, and in that they are parts of a sexual experience with men and women, which, as a gay male, I would not trade for the world with anyone else's. You must understand there are sexual experiences with both men and women I would happily give up. As I once told Carla, when I was 24, I was held down by 2 men and raped. When I was 7 or 8, I was sexually abused rather painfully by a girl a few years older than I at my first summer camp. Both experiences, believe me, I could easily have lived without. The tales I have told you here, as they touch on the sexual, however troublingly, belong to a range of sexual occurrences, the vast majority of which have never and can never make their way into language. The range that gives me my particular outlook on human sexuality, an outlook certainly different from many other people's, and those experiences have done more to dissolve any notions I ever held of normal and abnormal than all my readings on gender, perversion, and social construction put together. But the gay experience, distinct and specific and individual for every one of us, has always resided largely outside of language, because all sexuality, even all experience, largely resides there. And what has been let into language has always been highly coded. That coding represents a kind of police action, even while it is decried in the arena of politics, is often among us in the academic area of gay studies, say, for example, unnoticed. I've tried to bring up these specific and troubling tales to help cast into the light the smallest fragment of the context of, no, not some gay experience in general, for, as I hope my tales suggest, there is no such thing, but just to illuminate the context of the tales that I am now in the process of telling. For that's how the tales relate to each other. And if, when we talk, say, of some lines by Shakespeare or Whitman to a boy, citing the contestation of homophobic scholars, Or when we examine some profession of love to another woman in a letter by Emily Dickinson or Eleanor Roosevelt or Willa Cather, contested by equally homophobic scholars, or the coded narratives of Melville's Wide World of Navigation, of Oscar Wilde's or Dorothy Strachey's London, of Thomas Mann's circumscribed tourist town of Venice, or Juna Barnes' wonderfully sophisticated Paris, if we take these tales and assume that we are not dealing with a code that, in every case, excludes a context at least as complex and worrisome as the ones I have here gone to such narrative lengths to suggest, then I maintain we are betraying our object of interest through a misguided sense of our own freedom, by an adoration too uncritical of that wonderful, positive tale we all perhaps adore. What I hope worries you, what I hope troubles your sense of the appropriateness of these tales for the here and now, of what certainly most of us will experience as a liberating occasion, is what suggests that, even with the surge of linguistic freedom that has obtained since 1968, and with the movement toward political freedom that has been in motion since the Stonewall riots of 1969, what is accepted into language at any level is always highly coded, heavily policed. Though strictures relax or tighten at different places and in different periods, the relaxation never means that the policing or coding has somehow been escaped. The sexual experience is still largely outside language, at least as language is constituted on any number of levels. Because both today and in earlier times, when the sexual that was allowed into language was notably more than what has been allowed during that period of extraordinary official prescription any of us over 40 can still remember, we must not assume that everything is ever articulated. We are still dealing with topics that were always circumscribed by a greater or lesser linguistic coding and in a greater or lesser social policing. But even as we recover ourselves in this moment of general inclusiveness, I hope for at least a few moments I've been able to maneuver some of you into thinking, is this what gay identity is supposed to be? What does all this sneaker-licking, drunken undergraduate mischief and little girls urinating in a fountain in the park and another sob story of a hapless drug user have to do with my sexuality, my gay identity? For certainly raising that question was precisely that my intention. I said these tales were to trouble, and the troubling answer I would pose is fundamentally as simple as any of the stories themselves. Quite possibly, not much. The point to the notion of gay identity is that in terms of a transcendent reality concerned with sexuality per se, a universal similarity, a shared necessary condition, a defining aspect, a generalizable and inescapable essence or experience common to all men and women called gay, I believe gay identity has no more existence than a single, essential, transcendental sexual difference between men and women. Which is to say, I think the notion of gay identity represents the happily only partial congruence of two strategies, which have to do with a patriarchal society in which the dominant sexual ideology is heterosexist. In terms of heterosexist oppression of gays, gay identity represents a strategy for tarring a whole lot of very different people with the same brush. Billy, Mike, my perpetual virgin, at least, that is, if the people with the tar believe in transcendent differences between males and females. For those are precisely the people who historically have contrived to keep male homosexuality not talked of and lesbianism not talked of and trivial. And if, on the other hand, they simply believe deviance is deviance, then it includes as well you, me, Carla, and Hank. The tar is there in order to police a whole range of behaviors, not only in terms of the action that is language, but also in terms of the language that human actions themselves must generate. That includes the language of these stories. Now, in terms of gay rights, gay identity represents one strategy by which some of the people oppressed by heterosexism may come together, talk, and join forces to fight for the equality that certain egalitarian philosophies claim is due us all. In those terms, what we need these stories for is so that we don't get too surprised when we look at or start to listen to the person sitting next to us. That person, after all, may be me, or Hank, or Mike, or Carla, or anyone else I've spoken of this evening. In those terms, gay identity is a strategy I approve of wholly, even if, at a theoretical level, I question the existence of that identity as having anything beyond a provisional or strategic reality. That is to say, its place is precisely in the politically positivist comedy of liberation we began with, but possibly nowhere else. But the reason why the partial congruence between the two is finally happy is because it alone allows one group to speak, however inexactly, with the other. It allows those who have joined together in solidarity to speak to those who have been excluded, and, to me, even more important, it allows the excluded to speak back. That very partial congruence is the linguistic element of the conduit through which any change, as it manifests the response of a vigorous and meaningful activism, will transpire. From time to time, I have been accused, and have always taken it as praise, of trying to put the sex back into homosexuality. Here, not as a matter of nostalgia, but to facilitate an analytical and theoretical precision, I am trying to trouble the notion both of what we aver and what we are averse to, in its perversity and its diversity, or, if you will, through occasional appeals to the averse, I am trying to put a bit of the perversity back into perversion. I hope that many of you so inclined will welcome it, and to all of you this afternoon, love, luxury, justice, and joy. Thank you.
This concludes the National Lesbian and Gay Writers Conference, held October 8th through the 10th, 1993 in Boston, Massachusetts. This session was recorded live and on location by Conference Recording Service of Berkeley, California. For more information on other tapes in this series, please call 510-527-3600. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful conference, a wonderful OutWrite. Thank you.